Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. It is the week of May 20th, and this is your Monday briefing. So we're starting off the week with some timing perspective. As of today, there are 168 days until the 2024 presidential election and 50 days that Congress is scheduled to be in session. Is that enough time for a bill or two, perhaps, to pass? Here to offer his thoughts on how this time might work in the nation's capital is Todd Metcalf, a principal in PwC's Tax Policy Services practice and former Democratic Chief Tax Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee. Todd, welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to start off with last week, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden, who you worked under in Finance Committee, said if the tax bill is not addressed now, it's going to make negotiations perhaps complicated next year for the 2025 expiring provisions of the TCJA. So what possible action could happen right now on this bill?
A couple things. One, I think that what Senator Wyden was saying, broadly speaking, is if we can't get this sort of broadly bipartisan bill, small, broadly bipartisan bill done now, how can we possibly imagine that we're going to somehow wrestle with a $4.6 trillion transaction next year? So very legitimate question. Like, now sometimes there's an argument that like smaller things are harder to do than big things. And in Congress, that can prove especially true because the bigger something is, the less people can be fixated on small details. Whereas a smaller something, you've got, a little more energy to focus on, say, a single thing that bothers you. So I think he was saying that in terms of like, if we can't get this done, how can we possibly think that we're going to easily get this big deal done next year? Now, in terms of what's happening right now, there was some hope that maybe they would consider amendments to the FAA bill, and maybe because the FAA bill is a tax bill, that the deal could travel with the FAA bill. We know now that there were no amendments, including this tax bill. It doesn't look like that we're going to see a motion to proceed to that tax bill filed before this work period ends later this week.
Right.
But we are hearing some positive, seeing some positive signs that Senator Schumer may, after they return from the Memorial Day recess, so sometime in June, actually call the bill up for a vote. Because what we know is that we will never know whether there were 60 votes or not for this bill unless a vote is called. And so the hope now is that even if it's going to be a failed vote, that at least we will know its outcome.
So next week here in the United States, it is Memorial Day on Monday and the week Congress is out. So they have this week and then possibly, depending on what happens this week, the week of June 3rd when they get back.
Right.
So possibly some action, we could see some action that
possibly,
week as well.
Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned the $4.6 trillion number. The CBO raised that estimate for the cost of extending the provisions from TCJA. How does this affect next year's negotiations? Because that's a big number.
I mean, it was already a big number.
Right.
We already knew that it was somewhere north of $3, probably closer to $4 trillion. CBO upped the ante to 4.6. Now, that assumes that everything that's expiring gets extended. When we saw the Bush tax cuts, 15 years ago or so, when they came up for renewal, we saw 75 to 80% of those things renewed.
Right.
So I think that the notion that 100% is likely to get renewed, that's probably not going to happen. But even if you say, okay, let's say 80%, I mean, 80% of $4.6 trillion is still a far larger number than anything that we've considered in the recent past. So this is going to be tough. The question is, well, do you offset it at all? Do you not offset any of it? Do you offset some portion of it? Those are big questions that I don't think we know the answer to. But what I can say with confidence is there are not easy offsets for even a quarter of $4.6 trillion.
Right.
So it's going to be a very, very difficult, weight to lift if you're going to go down the path of trying to offset it and trying to be sort of more fiscally responsible than maybe we have been in the last few tax transactions, if you will.
Sure. So I want to turn to something we've been talking a lot about on the show, which is the tax teams. These are teams made up of Republican members of the Ways and Means Committee to address the 2025 issue around the TCJA provisions. So considering that this is an election year and we're pressed for time on a lot of issues, what is reasonable to expect that will get done? And what is it that stakeholders can contribute at this point and perhaps leading up to when this kind of gets into full swing?
The main purpose, probably, of these teams, honestly, is education for the members. We know that roughly 80% of the Republicans sitting on the Ways and Means Committee today were not sitting on the Ways and Means Committee in 2017 when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean they weren't in Congress. That doesn't mean that they didn't have an opinion on parts of it, and they probably voted for it one way or the other. But what it means is they were not in the room when the trade-offs were discussed, when there was a decision about, well, we're going to not just have guilty, we're also going to have beat. How did we get there? How did we get to guilty and beat? How are they different? What went into that? Why do we have a 20% deduction for certain pass-through income under 199 Cap A?
Right.
Where did that come from? That was new. So they weren't sort of in the room for those kinds of decisions. So part of the principle behind these teams is to educate them, to sort of bring them up to speed with, like, how did we get where we are? And then also to show them, okay, this is how we got where we are, but at the end of 2025, here's where we're going to be. And what do we want to extend? What do we want to maybe curb? What do we want to throw out because as not working? So, I mean, that's the underlying purpose. Now, what can stakeholders contribute? I have been saying, and I think all of our colleagues have been saying to taxpayers of all kinds, our clients, et cetera, is, look, this is the moment. If there are things in the TCJA that were very important to you, you should be going in and saying, here's how they're important to me and why.
Right.
And yes, I know that a lot of companies out there look at this in 2025 and they say, well, that's individual provisions. And so maybe I benefited as an individual taxpayer from provision X or Y, but that's what's expiring, not my corporate stuff. But at the end of the day, because of the size of this transaction, the company stuff is going to be on the table. Right. Because it's probably going to have to be on the table. So I think that taxpayers need to be going in now and saying, like, this is important to us. We need to protect, whether it's the 21% corporate rate or 100% expensing or whatever provision that is most important to them, we need to protect that. So try to take that off the table. And if they have ideas about how you could improve those provisions, this is the moment. Now, I think that the teams on the Ways and Means Committee, I think they're going to sort of outline a process for stakeholders to, submit their ideas, to advocate for those positions. The Senate Finance Committee, we don't have teams, we don't have working groups, right. Which we did have before the 2017 bill on a bipartisan basis. We had working groups that worked out some of these things. But I don't think that means that the taxpayers should be focused exclusively on Ways and Means, because there's going to have to be an education program of some kind for Finance Committee members and their staff. And so that advocacy can also be leveraged with those members as well.
Okay. I want to follow up on one thing. Do you know of, or anyone else on the policy team, taxpayers who have started to reach out with comments or any kind of feedback as a part of this process?
I am unaware of any taxpayer that has already submitted comments. I have talked to a number of taxpayers that are in the process of figuring out exactly how they plan to advance their ideas with the teams as well as with the Senate Finance Committee, if they have a structure, if they don't have a structure, how they're going to approach that. So there's already thinking going on. Okay. I don't think they're quite yet at the process of submitting things, because what we know with the teams is that the teams they've said, we're going to let folks know, here's how to submit your comments and your ideas. And so I think they're preparing for that.
Yes. Todd, thank you so much. Very helpful.
Thank you.
And a programming note, next Monday, May 27th, is the Memorial Day holiday here in the United States, and we will be off. Regular programming will resume on Tuesday, May 28th. And the latest episode of Election Watch with Rohit Kumar and Carl Rousseau is linked in the description of this episode, along with Week in Review. On behalf of the Policy on Demand team here in Washington, we appreciate you spending this time with us and hope you have a great week. Take care.